So we've seen the enormous change brought about by the second industrial revolution, both in terms of economic and cultural changes, and also political changes as a result. Second industrial revolution also had a considerable impact on the life of women, and correspondingly changed the dynamic between gender and politics in European society as well. So, Second Industrial Revolution first and foremost created a wide variation of new jobs for women. As we mentioned during the First Industrial Revolution, it did revolutionize the position of women in society. For the first time, women could essentially gain a level of independence by working in factories. Obviously, most of these were textile factories, so that was broadly the new line of work that was open to women. The Second Industrial Revolution firstly offered new jobs in terms of bureaucracy, office jobs, but it also, in some cases, allowed for individual female entrepreneurship as well. A good example of this actually was the emergence of the sewing machine. Singer invented the sewing machine in the 1850s, and with the rise of mass electricity in the late 19th century, it became possible for people to run sewing machines in their own homes, making goods, producing clothes, and things like that. And so a number of women actually became basically small business owners, working from home with their sewing machines. So that's one example of the new jobs that was available to women. More broadly speaking, the rise of mass bureaucracy, both within governments and within businesses themselves, provided new opportunities for women as well. For the first time, office jobs really became widely available to women. Now, most of these jobs were secretarial, and that's to say that women were usually employed on the bottom rung of the office ladder in these bureaucracies, and a lot of times didn't have any opportunity to rise up the ladder, so they were generally tend to be kept as secretaries. The jobs were relatively low skill. All that was required was basic literacy. They tended to be low paying, and of course, as always, women were paid less than men, even if oftentimes they were doing the exact same work. So new opportunities with the second industrial revolution, but still some very obvious gender imbalance is between men and women. In all European countries, and this is obviously something we talked about earlier, married women were basically considered the legal or legally deferential to their husbands. Whatever property women had legally belonged to their husbands. And even those married women who earned some wages for themselves were not allowed to keep their own wages. So the image I have here is, this is meant to be a stay-at-home mother asking the husband where the money is, what's he done with his wages, and he basically tells her, well, that's my business, that's nothing to do with you. So the idea that all financial matters in the house were ultimately the decision of the husband, and that included spending his wife's wages as well, because legally they were his wages. In almost all European countries, that was the legal norm. Divorce was quite difficult for women to obtain. So even if a woman found herself trapped in a marriage where she was quite unhappy, it was very, very difficult for her to obtain a divorce. It was difficult for men to obtain divorce as well, albeit somewhat easier. Again, so there was no gender equality in terms of access to divorce. And in case of divorce, quite often, courts tended to find in favour of men in terms of awarding children custody of children to husbands in the case of a divorce. So many women found themselves more or less trapped in marriages, oftentimes quite unhappy ones as well. And even though there were growing need for women to acquire literacy to avail of the new opportunities that were becoming available, education was generally off limits to women in many European countries, or if not off limits, it was extremely difficult for women to acquire. So literacy rates tended to be lower for women than men. Just to give you one example, in the United Kingdom in 1830, about 60% of men were literate, but only 30% of women. Now that gap narrowed as the 19th century went on, and by about 1870, women finally kind of caught up to men. So the literacy rate in the United Kingdom in 1870 was about 90%, and as it rose thereafter, it rose kind of broadly equal for men and women. But universities also oftentimes refuse to enrol women. In the United Kingdom, or in England more specifically, there were only 2 universities in England for most of the 19th century. Scotland, for example, had 4 universities. England only had 2. um, and women were not allowed to attend. So Oxford didn't allow women to enroll until 1921, and Cambridge did not follow suit for another almost 30 years. It wasn't until 1947 that women were actually allowed to enroll at Cambridge University. So even with the wide new range of jobs being available with the Second Industrial Revolution, women could get access to them, but these tended to be ones that were relatively low skill, basic literacy and nothing more required. Any job that required a degree through university was almost off limits to women. There were women who, through their own kind of personal perseverance, were able to acquire university level education. And in some cases, even to actually lecture at universities on the continent. Maria Montessori was a good example of this, a doctor who was able to actually become quite influential in the field of education. The textbook talks about an example of a Greek female professor who, in her first lecture in the University of Athens in the late 19th century, had male students shouting at her, get back into the kitchen, and kind of sexist slogans like this. So a very, very difficult time for women, even though there were some beginnings of more opportunity available for them. And not surprisingly, in this time period, we get the rise of feminism as a political ideology as well. Feminism, of course, was influenced by liberal thinking. We've already talked about liberalism before, the idea that people should have a say in government, that people should be relatively free in their individual choices. And not surprisingly, many women took these ideas and applied them to their own political position, and basically said, well, if people should have a big say in government, why don't women have a say in government? Why does the definition of people only apply to men? So the core demand of what we now call feminism for women in the 19th century was the right to have a vote. Nowhere in Europe or in the Western world in the mid-19th century did women have the vote. Does anyone know what the first country to actually allow women to vote was? It was in New Zealand. So in the late 19th century, there were a couple of US states that had granted women the right to vote as well, Wyoming being the first. But for the most part in the 19th century, women did not have a vote at all. Certainly no European countries where women extended the vote. So women wanted votes. And again, their thinking about why they were why having a vote was justified for them was very much influenced by traditional liberal thinking. But that is not to say that most male liberals supported the right of women to vote. In fact, oftentimes the very opposite. Many male liberals simply thought the idea of female voting was kind of an abomination. And in particular, what they were afraid of was that females or women would not be able to think for themselves, would not be able to vote as independent free thinkers. And of course, that is essential to liberal ideas in the 19th century about politics, that if people are educated and can think for themselves, their votes can be depended upon to make the best decision for everyone. But liberals felt this did not apply to women. They were very much afraid that women in particular would be controlled by religious leaders, by priests or other clerical figures, depending on what their religious background was. And this stems back to the ideas we talked about of the cult of domesticity. If you remember, the idea was that women were supposed to be more morally pure, more religious in their thinking compared to men. But the flip side of this was that male liberals were afraid that women would essentially be controlled by their religious leaders. Which is not to say there weren't male liberals who didn't support the right of women to vote. John Stuart Mill, whose document we read on liberty, we read in class, he was someone who advocated for female or the right of women to vote. Another liberal who we came across who was in favor of women's suffrage was Jeremy Bentham. So there were writers, as I say here in the PowerPoint, there were writers who argued that keeping women down, keeping their voices out of politics and denying them full access to economic positions and to education was not efficient. Kind of it hindered social progress. So there was a progressivist element of thought which argued that this is not economically efficient in order to keep half of the population kind of shut out of the economy and shut out of the political decision-making process. That was ultimately bad for society. Jeremy Bentham, who we encountered, he was famous as the author of Utilitarianism. Basically, his basic point was, well, whatever we're doing should be for the common good, should be for the greater happiness of everyone. And he argued that women had a pretty good case for why that their happiness should also be satisfied. If they wanted votes, essentially, Bentham agreed that they should have votes, and that there was nothing in the female character or female physiology that prevented them from being just as effective as men in terms of voting. Although Bentham, like a lot of male liberals, the idea was oftentimes, well, I support female women's suffrage, but because there's so many people opposed to it, it's not worth investing the energy to actually try and bring it about. And of course, many of the men who did support feminism also tended to have very unorthodox views, which further added to a sense that feminism was an extraordinarily radical political ideology. So to give you a couple of examples, in the United States, for example, Parker Pillsbury was a very famous abolitionist, and he was also a staunch advocate of feminism, as was Frederick Douglass. The famous slave who ran away and became an outspoken critic of slavery in the mid-19th century, was also a staunch feminist, advocating for female suffrage. But because they were also abolitionists, which also in the United States, well, not even just abolitionists, also were believed in racial equality. Again, that was a very, very radical idea. So many of the people and in Europe, obviously, slavery didn't exist in Europe, but some of the few male writers who were willing to speak up and advocate for women's suffrage also tended to be quite radical socialists or communists. And so the kind of on both sides of the Atlantic, feminism was very much associated with radical political thinking that was kind of maybe too radical for a lot of people. And of course, it's worth bearing in mind that not all women supported feminism, that there were many women who believed that a woman's place was at home, a woman's position was not to engage in politics, and they believed that feminism, because of its radical nature, would create social disunity, would create violent protests in order to kind of aggravating political tensions would lead to violence, and that in general it was a sign of a society that was somewhat corrupt, especially on the right. I mean, I mentioned above that liberals who opposed female or women voting, and just as a quick side note, it was actually in France. Women didn't get a vote until 1944, because after the First World War, in particular, it was the political left which was afraid of feminism for the reasons mentioned here, because they were afraid women would be controlled by religious figures. Of course, it's worth saying that on the political right, by definition, conservatives felt that women's suffrage was simply just too radical an idea to contemplate at all. One of the most famous women who actually was opposed to feminism was Queen Victoria in the United Kingdom. She called feminism a mad, insane folly, the idea that women should have a vote. So even someone who was the head of government, in the case of Queen Victoria, opposed feminism. But as we'll see in a moment, despite her attitudes, it was precisely in the United Kingdom that feminism was to have the strongest voice of anywhere in Europe, that was to lead the charge for women's suffrage in Europe.